Patricia Hawkins had been adjusting her uniform for 23 years, and she still took pride in getting every detail right. Pressed shirt, polished shoes, name tag positioned precisely 2 inches above her breast pocket. Standards mattered, especially in first class. Especially when passengers paid premium prices for premium service. The crew briefing had been routine: weather delays, passenger manifest review, safety protocols. But as Patricia reviewed the passenger list one more time, she found herself pausing at seat 2, a no frequent flyer status indicated. No notes about dietary restrictions or special accommodations. Just a name and an economy to first class upgrade processed less than 12 hours ago. Last-minute upgrades happened, of course, but they usually came with explanations: airline status, corporate accounts, family emergencies. This one had no backstory, and in Patricia's experience, that usually meant someone who didn't understand the unwritten rules of first-class service. "Busy flight today?" asked Jennifer, the newer flight attendant assigned to work the main cabin. Patricia nodded, though her attention remained focused on the passenger list. "We've got some interesting bookings up front. That tech executive in 3C always wants his whiskey neat, never on the rocks. The French family in row 5 are lovely, but they'll want everything explained in detail, very particular about service." Jennifer glanced over Patricia's shoulder at the manifest. "What about 2A?" "That one's different." Patricia couldn't quite put her finger on what bothered her about the booking. The passenger had paid for the upgrade, had every right to the seat, met all the requirements, but something felt off in a way she couldn't articulate. Passengers like that sometimes don't understand the atmosphere we maintain up there. The expectations are different. Jennifer raised an eyebrow. "Passengers like what?" Patricia realized how that sounded and backtracked quickly. "I just mean passengers who aren't familiar with first-class service. It's a delicate balance, maintaining the experience for our regulars while accommodating newcomers. We have to be diplomatic." "Diplomatic about what exactly?" "About maintaining standards." Patricia's voice carried the weight of 2 decades in premium service. "The passengers in first class pay for a certain environment. Part of our job is protecting that investment, making sure everyone fits the culture." She'd convinced herself this was about service excellence, about maintaining the premium experience that justified the ticket prices. The fact that certain types of passengers seemed to naturally fit that culture while others required more scrutiny felt like a professional observation rather than personal bias. When boarding began, Patricia positioned herself at the entrance to first class, greeting each passenger with practiced warmth. The tech executive received a broad smile and immediate recognition. She remembered his drink preferences from 6 months ago. The French family got her rusty but enthusiastic attempts at basic French phrases. The elderly gentleman was complimented on his book choice. But when she saw the woman approaching seat 2A, every instinct Patricia had developed over 23 years told her something was wrong. Not wrong in any way she could defend or explain to a supervisor. Just wrong for this cabin, wrong for this service level, wrong for the expectations of passengers who paid 4 times more for these seats. The woman wasn't doing anything inappropriate. Her dress was professional, her manner quiet and respectful. She found her seat without assistance, stowed her carry-on efficiently, fastened her seatbelt before being asked. Everything about her behavior was exactly what any flight attendant would want from any passenger. Everything about her presence felt like an intrusion Patricia needed to address. She watched from the galley as the woman settled in, opened a book, checked her phone once, then returned to reading. Model passenger behavior, and yet Patricia found herself cataloging small details that seemed to justify her discomfort. The book was a medical text rather than the business biography or literary fiction she expected in first class. The phone was newer but not the latest model. The wedding ring was simple gold, not the complex designer pieces she usually saw. "She's not causing any problems," Jennifer observed, following Patricia's gaze. "Not yet," Patricia replied, though she couldn't have explained what problem she anticipated. Patricia had built her career on maintaining standards, on preserving the first-class experience for passengers who belonged there. She genuinely believed that protecting those standards was part of her professional duty. The fact that her definition of belonging had never been examined, never questioned, never held up against the simple reality that anyone with a ticket had the right to respectful service. That recognition lived in a part of her mind she'd learned not to visit. She was about to visit it anyway. 3 rows back, Marcus Webb was trying to decide whether to mind his own business. The retired English teacher had spent 43 years learning to read the subtle dynamics of enclosed spaces. Classrooms, faculty meetings, parent conferences, they all had their rhythms, their warning signs, their moments when intervention became necessary. The first-class cabin of Flight 447 was starting to feel like a classroom right before trouble erupted. Marcus had noticed the flight attendant's behavior immediately. Not because he was looking for problems, but because after 4 decades of watching teenagers navigate social hierarchies, he developed an instinct for spotting the moment when someone in authority decided to flex that authority inappropriately. The woman in seat 2A was reading quietly, bothering no one, displaying exactly the kind of respectful behavior any service professional would appreciate. The flight attendant's repeated glances in her direction, the slight tightening around her eyes each time she looked that way, the way she'd positioned herself to maintain visual contact with that specific seat. All of it reminded Marcus of the subtle aggression he'd witnessed in school hallways when certain students were marked as problems for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual behavior. He'd pulled out his phone initially just to text his daughter about the flight delay, but something made him open the camera app instead. Not to record anything yet. He wasn't even sure anything would happen. But ready, the way he'd learned to be ready when he sensed a situation might escalate beyond words. Marcus had seen enough injustice in his teaching career to recognize the early warning signs. He'd also seen enough good people stay silent during those moments to know that silence was its own form of participation. At 67, flying first class for the first time in his life thanks to his daughter's airline miles, he was still learning when to speak up and when to document. His phone's camera icon stared back at him from the screen, waiting for him to decide what kind of person he wanted to be at 30,000 feet. The woman in 2A turned a page in her book, completely unaware that she was being studied, evaluated, judged by someone whose professional responsibility was simply to offer her a beverage and treat her with basic human dignity. She had no idea that the flight attendant was building a case against her presence, looking for reasons to challenge her right to occupy the seat she'd paid for. Marcus watched the flight attendant's face as she prepared to make her move, and he made his decision about whose side he was going to be on when this situation inevitably exploded. He kept his phone ready and waited for someone to give him a reason to use it. Patricia approached seat 2A with her service smile firmly in place, but something harder lived behind her eyes. She'd convinced herself this was about maintaining standards, about ensuring that first-class passengers received the premium experience they'd paid for. The fact that this particular passenger seemed to challenge those standards simply by existing had become, in Patricia's mind, a legitimate professional concern. "Excuse me, miss." Patricia's voice carried the practiced sweetness of customer service, with an undertone that suggested this wasn't entirely a friendly check-in. Sarah looked up from her medical journal, her expression patient and attentive. "Yes. I just wanted to make sure you're comfortable. Is this your first time in first class?" The question sounded innocent enough, but Sarah had heard variations of it throughout her career. In medical conferences, in hospital boardrooms, in professional settings where her presence was questioned not because of her qualifications, but because of assumptions about who belonged in premium spaces. "I'm fine, thank you," Sarah replied simply, returning her attention to her book. Patricia didn't move away. "May I just double-check your boarding pass?" Sometimes there can be confusion with last-minute upgrades. Sarah looked up again, this time with a slight crease between her eyebrows. She'd already presented her boarding pass during the initial boarding process. Her seat assignment was clearly displayed on the overhead monitor. There was no reasonable basis for this request except the kind of suspicion she'd encountered before. "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked, her voice remaining level. "Oh no, no problem at all," Patricia said, though her smile had tightened. "I'm just making sure everyone's comfortable. The passengers in first class expect a certain environment." Sarah studied Patricia's face for a moment, recognizing the careful language of someone who wanted to say something more direct, but was constrained by professional requirements. She reached into her purse and produced her boarding pass, handing it over without comment. Patricia examined the boarding pass with theatrical thoroughness, comparing the seat number to her passenger manifest, as if there might be some discrepancy that hadn't been apparent during the initial boarding process. Other passengers were beginning to notice the extended interaction, though most pretended to focus on their own activities. Marcus Webb, 3 rows back, felt his thumb hover over his phone's record button. "Everything appears to be in order," Patricia said finally, though her tone suggested disappointment rather than relief. She handed the boarding pass back, but didn't move away from Sarah's seat. "Are you traveling for business?" It was another question designed to sound like friendly customer service, while serving a different purpose entirely. Sarah recognized the probing for what it was, an attempt to establish whether she belonged in this cabin based on whatever criteria Patricia had decided were relevant. "I am," Sarah said simply. "What kind of business, if you don't mind me asking?" Sarah closed her book, realizing this interaction wasn't going to end with polite deflection. "Is there something specific you need from me?" Patricia's smile faltered slightly. She hadn't expected direct pushback, hadn't anticipated that this passenger might recognize the subtext of her questions and respond accordingly. "I'm just trying to provide excellent service," Patricia said, though her voice had lost some of its artificial warmth. "Our first-class passengers appreciate attention to detail." "I appreciate being left alone to read," Sarah replied. The words hung in the air between them, polite but firm, establishing a boundary that Patricia clearly hadn't expected to encounter. Other passengers were no longer pretending not to notice the interaction. The elderly gentleman in 3B had lowered his newspaper. The French family was watching with undisguised curiosity. Patricia felt the attention of the cabin focusing on her, and something shifted in her approach. She'd started this interaction believing she was protecting the standards of first-class service. Now it felt like those standards and her authority to enforce them were being challenged. She wasn't satisfied. Patricia stepped back from seat 2A, but only to regroup. The passengers' calm responses had been correct, professional, entirely appropriate. They'd also felt like resistance to Patricia's authority, and after 23 years of managing first-class service, she wasn't accustomed to passengers who didn't defer to her judgment about who belonged in premium cabins. She walked to the front galley and picked up the internal phone, dialing the cockpit. "Captain Morrison, this is Patricia in first class. Could you spare a moment to speak with me about a passenger situation?" Marcus Webb watched Patricia's body language change as she made the call. Her posture straightened. Her voice dropped to the confidential tone service professionals used when they wanted to convey that a situation was more serious than it appeared to casual observers. He'd seen administrators use the same tone when they called security to remove students who hadn't actually broken any rules but had somehow been designated as problems. He opened his phone's camera app and started recording, though he kept the device low and inconspicuous. 43 years of teaching had taught him that documentation often mattered more than intervention, especially when the people in authority convinced themselves they were acting appropriately. Jennifer, the flight attendant working the main cabin, approached the galley as Patricia ended her call. "Everything okay up here?" Jennifer asked. Patricia lowered her voice. "The passenger in 2A, something feels off about her presence here. She's not responding appropriately to service protocols." Jennifer glanced toward seat 2A, where Sarah had returned to reading her medical journal. "She seems fine to me. What did she do?" "It's not what she did, it's how she did it." Patricia struggled to articulate her concerns in ways that would sound professional rather than personal. "She was resistant when I tried to verify her seat assignment, defensive when I asked about her travel plans. The passengers in first class expect to travel with people who understand the culture here." Jennifer's expression grew uncertain. She'd worked with Patricia for 6 months and had learned to trust the senior flight attendant's judgment about passenger management. But nothing she'd observed about the woman in 2A suggested any kind of problem that required escalation. "Maybe she's just tired," Jennifer suggested. "Business travelers can be pretty focused on their own things." "Maybe," Patricia said, though her tone suggested she didn't find that explanation adequate. "But I've got a responsibility to maintain the environment these passengers pay for. If someone doesn't fit that environment—" She left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Patricia had decided that Sarah didn't fit, and she was prepared to take action to protect what she saw as the integrity of first-class service. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom, asking Patricia to step into the cockpit for a brief conversation. She straightened her uniform and headed forward, leaving Jennifer to monitor the cabin. Sarah continued reading, apparently unaware that her quiet presence had been escalated to the flight's commanding officer. She turned a page, made a small note in the margin, checked her phone briefly, then returned to her text. Every action was measured, professional, exactly the kind of behavior any airline would want from any passenger in any cabin. But Patricia had moved beyond observing Sarah's behavior. She decided that Sarah's presence itself was the problem, and she was seeking the authority necessary to address it. Marcus Webb watched Patricia disappear into the cockpit and increased his phone's recording resolution. His teaching experience told him that when administrators started making calls about students who weren't actually causing problems, the situation was about to get significantly worse for everyone involved. Other passengers had begun to sense the tension. The tech executive glanced up from his laptop, noting the unusual activity in the galley. The French family whispered among themselves in rapid conversation. Even the elderly gentleman had put down his book entirely, his attention focused on the subtle drama unfolding 3 rows ahead. The cabin had developed the peculiar electricity that preceded institutional confrontations. The sense that someone in authority was preparing to exercise that authority in ways that had little to do with actual necessity, and everything to do with maintaining what they perceived as appropriate order. Sarah remained focused on her reading, though Marcus noticed her grip on the book had tightened slightly. She knew something was building around her. She just didn't know how far Patricia was willing to escalate it. She was about to find out. Captain Morrison emerged from the cockpit with Patricia, his expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who'd been briefed on a situation he didn't fully understand but was prepared to handle professionally. Behind them came David Reynolds, the flight's senior purser, whose presence indicated this had officially moved beyond a simple passenger service issue. Marcus Webb's finger hovered over his phone's livestream button. He'd started recording when Patricia made her phone call, but live streaming felt like crossing a line he wasn't sure he was ready to cross. Still, something about the way 3 crew members were now approaching one quiet passenger made him think documentation might become very important very quickly. 14 minutes to departure. The gate agent's voice carried clearly through the cabin as she announced the upcoming pushback, her tone cheerfully oblivious to the tension building in first class. "Dr. Chen," Captain Morrison's voice was professional, respectful, but carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "I'm Captain Morrison. Could we speak for a moment?" Sarah looked up from her medical journal, taking in the 3 crew members standing beside her seat. Every other conversation in first class had stopped. Phones were being discreetly positioned for recording. The elderly gentleman had his hand halfway to his own device. "Of course," Sarah said, closing her book but remaining seated. "How can I help you?" Captain Morrison glanced at Patricia, who nodded slightly, as if confirming something they'd discussed privately. "Ms. Hawkins here has some concerns about your seating assignment. I'm sure we can resolve this quickly and get everyone comfortable." Sarah's expression didn't change, but Marcus noticed her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. After 4 decades of watching students respond to administrative pressure, he recognized someone preparing to be very, very careful about their next words. "What concerns?" Sarah asked. Patricia stepped forward, emboldened by the captain's presence. "As I mentioned earlier, first-class passengers expect a certain environment. We've had some questions about whether there might have been an error with your upgrade processing." 12 minutes to departure. Sarah reached into her purse and produced her boarding pass, her frequent flyer card, and her credit card receipt showing the upgrade purchase. She handed them to Captain Morrison without a word. Captain Morrison examined the documents while Patricia leaned in to point out details that she apparently found significant. David Reynolds looked increasingly uncomfortable as the interaction continued, glancing between Sarah's perfectly valid documentation and the growing audience of passengers who were no longer pretending not to watch. "Everything appears to be in order," Captain Morrison said finally, though he didn't return the documents immediately. "Sir," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a confidential tone that still carried clearly through the quiet cabin, "passengers like her sometimes have difficulty understanding the expectations in premium service. We've found it's often better to address these situations before they become uncomfortable for everyone." Marcus Webb hit the livestream button. His screen showed 3 viewers immediately, probably just random people scrolling through live feeds. But something about Patricia's words, about the way she'd said "passengers like her," made him think this was about to become the kind of situation that people needed to see. Sarah looked directly at Captain Morrison. "Which federal aviation regulation requires passengers to demonstrate their understanding of premium service expectations in order to occupy seats they've legally purchased?" The question hung in the cabin air like a challenge. It was spoken quietly, without emotion, but with the precision of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had decided to respond with facts rather than defensiveness. Captain Morrison's expression shifted slightly. He'd been briefed on a passenger service issue, but Sarah's response suggested this might be something else entirely, something that could become legally complicated if handled incorrectly. 9 minutes to departure. Marcus glanced at his phone screen, 47 viewers now climbing steadily. Someone in the comments had written, "Is this really happening?" Another, "First class Corinne alert." Patricia's face had flushed slightly at Sarah's question, but she pressed forward. "This isn't about regulations. It's about maintaining the standard of service our premium passengers expect. Some people just don't understand how to behave appropriately in first class." "How exactly have I behaved inappropriately?" Sarah asked. It was a simple question, but it cut to the heart of Patricia's entire approach. Every complaint she'd raised, every concern she'd expressed, every reason she'd given for escalating this situation had been about Sarah's presence, not Sarah's behavior. David Reynolds cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am, perhaps we could find you a more comfortable seat in our main cabin." "No," Sarah said simply. "I purchased this seat. I'm going to sit in this seat." 7 minutes to departure. The gate agent's voice was starting to carry a note of urgency about the impending pushback. Captain Morrison's radio crackled. Air traffic control needed to speak with him about their departure slot. The tech executive was typing rapidly on his phone. The French family was filming openly now. Marcus's viewer count hit 250. Someone had shared the stream link in what looked like a social media group. Comments were flowing faster than he could read them. Sarah sat quietly through the growing chaos around her seat, her medical journal closed in her lap, her hands folded, her expression calm. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't argued with anyone's authority, hadn't done anything that could be construed as disruptive or inappropriate. She'd simply refused to accept that her paid seat wasn't actually her seat. Captain Morrison's radio crackled again, more insistently this time. He needed to make a decision about this situation so they could proceed with departure, but Sarah's legal challenge had complicated what Patricia had presented as a simple service issue. His phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was local to the airline's headquarters. He answered on the second ring, stepping slightly away from Sarah's seat to take the call privately. "Captain Morrison, this is Janet Walsh from Corporate Risk Management. We're monitoring a developing situation on your flight. Can you confirm the status of the passenger in seat 2A? Captain Morrison felt the ground shift beneath his feet, though he couldn't yet understand why. Patricia felt it before she understood it. The ground was shifting. "How are you monitoring?" Captain Morrison began, but Janet Walsh cut him off. "Social media, Captain. There's a live stream from your cabin with over 1,500 viewers and climbing. The passenger you're questioning, do you know who she is?" Captain Morrison looked back at Sarah, who sat with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout the interaction. Her medical journal, he noticed for the first time, wasn't a general text but something highly specialized. The bookmark protruding from its pages had what looked like a hospital logo. 6 minutes to departure, and his radio was crackling with increasingly urgent messages from air traffic control. "I need you to walk away from that passenger immediately," Janet Walsh continued. "Do not ask her any more questions. Do not request that she move seats. Do not do anything except provide her with exemplary service and hope this situation doesn't go viral in the next 10 minutes. Ma'am, my flight attendant raised legitimate concerns about." "Captain Morrison." Janet Walsh's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent the last 5 minutes watching the airline stock price fluctuate in real time. "The passenger you're harassing is Dr. Sarah Chen. She's the cardiac surgeon who saved Congressman Martinez's life last year. She's been featured on the cover of 3 medical journals this quarter. She serves on the board of 2 major hospitals and has a reputation that makes our airline look like a regional commuter service." Captain Morrison felt his stomach drop somewhere around his shoes. "But more importantly," Janet continued, "she's currently being live-streamed to an audience that's approaching 5,000 people, most of whom are very interested to know why an airline crew is questioning a prominent surgeon's right to sit in a seat she purchased." Marcus Webb watched Captain Morrison's face change color and knew his decision to start live streaming had been the right one. His viewer count was climbing exponentially now, 3,200, 3,800, 4,400. The comment section had become a blur of outrage and support, with people sharing the stream faster than he could track. Someone had identified the airline from the uniform designs. Someone else had found the flight number from the boarding announcements audible in his audio. The airline's Twitter account was already being bombarded with questions about their passenger screening policies. Patricia watched Captain Morrison's phone conversation with growing unease. She couldn't hear the details, but his body language told a story she didn't want to read. The confident authority he'd brought to address her passenger concerns was melting away with each word from whoever was on the other end of that call. "There's been a mistake," Captain Morrison said when he ended the call. His voice was carefully controlled, but Marcus could see sweat beading on his forehead. "Dr. Chen, please accept my sincere apologies for any inconvenience. Ms. Hawkins was simply being thorough about passenger comfort, but clearly there's been a misunderstanding." Sarah looked up at him with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting something like this. Not the specific details, perhaps, but the general pattern of recognition followed by backtracking. "What kind of misunderstanding?" she asked. 5 minutes to departure. The urgency in air traffic control's radio calls was becoming impossible to ignore, but Captain Morrison found himself caught between departure requirements and damage control for a situation that was spiraling beyond his experience. Patricia stepped forward, apparently not yet understanding that the ground had shifted completely beneath her feet. "Dr. Chen, I hope you understand that we were simply trying to maintain the high standards our first-class passengers expect." "Stop talking," Captain Morrison said sharply, cutting off Patricia mid-sentence. The comment was quiet but carried clearly through the cabin, and Marcus's livestream audience heard every word. The viewer count had passed 6,000, and someone in the comments had posted a link to Dr. Sarah Chen's biography from the National Medical Association. The story was writing itself in real time across social media platforms. Sarah remained seated, her expression unchanged, watching the crew members' increasing panic with the detached interest of someone observing a clinical case study in institutional failure. "Dr. Chen," Captain Morrison tried again, "is there anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable? Anything at all?" "You could complete the boarding process and depart on schedule," Sarah replied evenly. 4 minutes to departure. Marcus's phone was heating up from the processing demands of the livestream. 7,000 viewers now, with major social media accounts beginning to share clips. Someone had started a hashtag. Someone else had found the airline CEO's contact information. Patricia finally seemed to grasp that something fundamental had changed. "I was just doing my job," she said, though no one had asked for justification. "Your job," David Reynolds said quietly, "is to serve beverages and ensure passenger safety, not to determine who belongs in first class based on your personal assessment of their appearance or background." It was the first time anyone from the crew had directly challenged Patricia's actions, and Marcus's audience noticed immediately. The comment section exploded with approval for Reynolds, while simultaneously expressing outrage that it had taken this long for someone to state the obvious. Sarah opened her medical journal and returned to reading, as if the chaos surrounding her seat was merely background noise to be politely ignored. The gesture was dismissive in the most professional possible way, suggesting that these people had already taken more of her time than their authority warranted. Captain Morrison's radio crackled with a message that couldn't be ignored any longer. Air traffic control needed an immediate response about their departure readiness, and the gate agents were beginning the final boarding announcements. But his phone was ringing again, and this time the caller ID showed his direct supervisor's number. Marcus's viewer count hit 10,000 as Captain Morrison answered what was clearly going to be another very difficult conversation. The elderly gentleman in seat 3B leaned toward Marcus and whispered, "Young man, I hope you're recording all of this." Marcus held up his phone, showing the livestream interface and the climbing viewer count. "Good," the elderly man said. "Some things need to be witnessed." Captain Morrison's voice was barely a whisper into his phone. "Yes, sir, Dr. Sarah Chen, she's on my aircraft right now." He paused, listening to something that made his shoulders drop. "I understand. We'll handle this immediately." He ended the call and turned to Patricia, his voice measured but strained. "Do you know who you've been arguing with?" "A passenger who?" "Dr. Sarah Chen is on the board of directors for Mercy General Hospital," Morrison said quietly. "They're our largest corporate client, 43 flights per month, medical conference contracts worth $2.7 million annually." Patricia's mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. Marcus's livestream audience watched her face cycle through confusion, recognition, and the first bloom of genuine concern. 10,000 viewers had become 12,000, and someone in the comments had found Mercy General's website, posting screenshots of the board of directors page. "I was just following protocol," Patricia said, her voice smaller now. She didn't look like she belonged in first class. Sarah turned a page in her medical journal, the sound crisp and final in the suddenly quiet cabin. She hadn't looked up once during Morrison's revelation. "Dr. Chen," Morrison approached her seat again, "please accept our sincere apologies for this misunderstanding. Ms. Walker was overzealous in her interpretation of our seating policies." "There was no misunderstanding," Sarah replied without lifting her eyes from her reading. "Your flight attendant saw exactly what she expected to see." The cabin fell silent except for the steady hum of auxiliary power units and the distant sound of ground crew preparing for departure. A child coughed softly. 3 rows back. Someone's phone buzzed once and went quiet. The silence stretched longer than comfortable. Then Captain Morrison's phone rang again. "Morrison here." His face changed as he listened. The color drained from his cheeks in a way that had nothing to do with cabin lighting. "Sir, yes, I understand. She's here now." Marcus's audience watched Morrison's hand shake almost imperceptibly as he lowered the phone. 14,000 viewers now, with the story spreading across social media faster than the crew could comprehend. "Dr. Chen," Morrison's voice carried a weight that made every passenger within earshot turn to listen. "That was Harrison Matthews, our CEO. He wanted me to inform you that he's personally reviewed this situation. He also wanted me to tell you that he's been trying to reach you for the past 6 months about a position." Sarah finally looked up from her journal. "He's been hoping to offer you the chief medical advisor position for our airline," Morrison continued, each word seeming to cost him something. "We've been trying to recruit you to oversee our medical emergency protocols and pilot health certifications. The board of directors has approved a significant compensation package for the role." The words hung in the cabin air like a physical presence. Patricia's face went from pale to chalk white, the change happening so gradually that passengers could actually watch the color leave her skin. Her hands, which had been gesturing authoritatively minutes before, now hung motionless at her sides. Marcus's phone was practically vibrating with notifications. 16,000 viewers. The comments section was moving too fast to read, a waterfall of reactions and shares and tags. "Mr. Matthews also wanted me to tell you," Morrison continued, his voice barely audible now, "that the airline's Diversity and Inclusion Task Force has been waiting for your input on our hiring and training practices, specifically our customer service protocols." Patricia's breathing had become shallow and visible. She gripped the back of a seat with both hands, her knuckles standing out white against her skin. Sarah closed her medical journal and looked directly at Patricia for the first time since boarding. And that's when Patricia finally understood, not just what she had done, what she had done too. The collapse wasn't immediate or dramatic. Patricia didn't scream or cry or dramatically fall to her knees. Instead, she seemed to fold inward, like a building whose foundation had been quietly removed. Her shoulders curved forward. Her grip on the seat back tightened until her hands trembled with the effort. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I couldn't have known." But the livestream audience had already found Dr. Chen's biography on the National Medical Association website. They'd found her Harvard Medical School faculty page. They'd found the articles about her pioneering research in emergency medicine, her testimony before Congress on healthcare reform, her appointment to the President's Health Advisory Council. The man in seat 1C, who had earlier nodded approvingly when Patricia first approached Sarah, now studied his phone screen with intense concentration, his jaw tight. The woman in 2A, who had whispered, "Finally someone with standards," clutched her designer handbag against her chest as if it could shield her from what she'd witnessed and tacitly endorsed. David Reynolds moved quietly through the cabin, checking overhead bins with professional efficiency, but his movements were stiff, deliberate. He'd worked with Patricia for 3 years. He'd heard her make comments before, small judgments about passengers that he'd let slide in the name of crew harmony. Now those moments played back in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Sarah reopened her journal, but she wasn't reading anymore. She was thinking about all the times she'd been questioned, challenged, asked to prove she belonged in spaces where her qualifications should have been sufficient. The medical conferences where she was assumed to be a nurse. The hospital boards where her expertise was questioned until she produced her credentials. The restaurants where hosts looked past her to find who they assumed was the actual doctor. This wasn't victory. This was just another Tuesday. Marcus's viewer count hit 18,000 as the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, 47 minutes behind schedule. But by then, the delay was the least of the airline's concerns. The stock price began dropping before they reached cruising altitude. Golden Airways shares fell 12% in the first 4 hours after takeoff, erasing $847 million in market value, enough money to buy every employee in that cabin a house. Gone, in the time it takes to fly from Chicago to Denver. The airline's customer service department received over 2,000 complaints within 6 hours, more than they typically processed in a month. The Federal Aviation Administration opened an investigation into discriminatory practices. 3 civil rights organizations issued statements calling for comprehensive policy reviews across the entire industry. Patricia Walker was terminated before the aircraft landed, the decision made by executives who watched Marcus's live stream from their offices 37,000 feet below. The severance package was minimal, limited to what her contract required and nothing more. But the numbers that mattered most were different ones entirely. 734 formal discrimination complaints were already pending against Golden Airways, filed by passengers who had experienced similar treatment but lacked the platform or power to make their stories heard. Sarah's incident became the catalyst that brought those voices forward. The emergency board meeting convened at Golden Airways headquarters while the flight was still airborne. 12 executives sat around a mahogany conference table, watching Marcus's live stream on a wall-mounted screen. The audio was turned low, but the visual was enough. They could see Patricia's collapse, Sarah's dignity, the uncomfortable shifting of passengers who wished they had acted differently. "How do we fix this?" someone asked. "We don't fix this," CEO Harrison Matthews replied. "We learn from it." The policy changes were announced before Sarah's flight landed. Mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees. Body cameras for flight attendants during passenger interactions. Third-party audits of seating assignments and upgrade procedures. A zero-tolerance policy for discrimination with immediate termination for violations, no exceptions. 3 competing airlines issued their own statements within 48 hours, each announcing enhanced diversity initiatives and customer protection policies. The industry was adapting, not out of altruism, but out of the recognition that viral videos and social media accountability had fundamentally changed the cost of discrimination. Sarah was invited to appear on 6 different news programs and declined them all. She agreed to meet with a congressional subcommittee on transportation equity, but only in a closed session, away from cameras. Her focus wasn't on publicity but on policy, not on personal vindication but on systemic change. Marcus's life changed more dramatically than he'd anticipated. The video reached 2 million views within a week. Media outlets wanted interviews. Speaking bureaus wanted to book him for events about social justice and the power of documentation. But he found himself uncomfortable with the attention, troubled by the fact that his moment of witness had become more famous than Dr. Chen's lifetime of achievement. 6 months later, Marcus still flew regularly for work, and he still kept his phone charged. He developed a habit of looking around aircraft cabins with different eyes, noticing interactions he might have missed before. He'd seen 2 more incidents since that day in Chicago, smaller moments of bias and assumption, and he'd quietly recorded both. Not for the views or the viral potential, but because he'd learned that witnessing without action was a form of complicity. She still flew that airline. She just kept her phone charged, just in case. 1 year after the incident, the changes were visible throughout the industry. Customer service complaints related to discrimination had dropped by 38% across major airlines. Training programs had been overhauled. Promotion criteria had been revised to include diversity and inclusion metrics. Dr. Sarah Chen never took the chief medical advisor position with Golden Airways, choosing instead to maintain her independence and her ability to critique the industry from the outside. But she did consult on their policy development, and her recommendations became the template that other airlines adopted. The broader impact extended beyond aviation. The incident became a case study in business schools, examining the intersection of social media accountability, corporate responsibility, and the real cost of discrimination. It was taught in sociology classes as an example of how individual bias reflects systemic inequities. It was analyzed in communications courses as a demonstration of how quickly institutional reputation could be damaged in the digital age. Sarah Chen boarded a flight last Thursday, first class. Nobody asked her twice. Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed today was not extraordinary. That's the point. What happened on that aircraft wasn't about one flight attendant making one mistake. It was about a system of assumptions so deeply embedded that it operates invisibly until someone shines a light directly on it. It's about who we assume belongs in positions of authority and who we expect to prove their worthiness. It's about the difference between credentials and credibility, and how that gap is determined by factors that should never matter. Patricia Walker wasn't a villain in the classical sense. She was a product of unconscious bias, trained by a culture that taught her to make quick judgments based on appearance, to trust her instincts about who looked like they belonged in premium spaces. Her mistake wasn't malicious intent but unexamined assumption, and that makes it more dangerous, not less. The passengers who initially supported her, who nodded approval when she questioned Sarah's presence, weren't inherently bad people either. They were bystanders who found it easier to accept someone else's judgment than to examine their own discomfort with challenging authority, even when that authority was clearly wrong. The real question isn't whether you would have been Patricia Walker. The real question is, what would you have done when you witnessed what Patricia Walker was doing? Would you have been Marcus, documenting what you saw? Would you have been David Reynolds, staying silent until the very end? Would you have been the elderly gentleman who offered quiet encouragement, or would you have been one of the passengers who looked the other way? The difference between Marcus and everyone else in that cabin wasn't courage, necessarily. It was the decision to stop waiting for someone else to act first. It was the recognition that individual action, even something as simple as holding up a phone, could become collective accountability when amplified through the right channels. Have you ever witnessed something like this and wished you'd said something? Not necessarily discrimination on an airplane, but any moment when you saw someone being treated unfairly, dismissed, or diminished, and you stayed quiet. Tell me in the comments. Not to judge you, but to acknowledge that these moments happen far more often than we document, and the cost of our silence is higher than we usually calculate. If you believe that the stories that make the most difference are the ones nobody's talking about, this channel is for you. We don't chase viral moments or manufactured outrage. We examine the everyday injustices that reveal larger truths about how our institutions work and who they're designed to serve. We look at the moments when ordinary people make choices that create extraordinary change, not because they set out to be heroes, but because they decided that witnessing wasn't enough. Tag someone who needs to see this, not to make them angry or to fuel their outrage, but to remind them what quiet power looks like. To show them that the most effective resistance often comes not from shouting or confrontation, but from simply refusing to let injustice proceed without witness. Share this with someone who needs to understand that their voice matters, that their phone has power, that their presence in moments of discrimination is not neutral. Because in the end, the most important lesson from that aircraft cabin isn't about airlines or customer service or even discrimination policies. It's about the choice we all face when we witness injustice. The choice between comfortable silence and uncomfortable truth, between being a bystander and being a witness, between letting systems operate in darkness and insisting that they face the light.